Hello everyone, welcome to this session on the future of work. This is Kathy Hartley, module leader for HRM&D in a global context at Salford Business School. Okay, so this slide is looking at an infographic from the CIPD, the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development, which is the professional body for HR practice. And this was going back a decade looking at trends. And it's interesting to see really, what was a trend sort of 10, 11 years ago and, how that's shifting now. So one of the things they were talking about as a mega trend was the process of deindustrialization, or the shift from manufacturing to service industry. So we were seeing certainly in the UK and in Europe a shift really, where we'd seen in the 60s around about a third of the population employed in manufacturing. There was a much bigger shift to the service sector certainly in the UK. And we saw that really, I think, around many parts of Europe. There was an increase in educational attainment, so we were starting to see more people having degrees and higher degrees, master's level degrees, so populations becoming more educated. Technology and globalization, there was a real shift. We know that ICT, information and communication technology, has been part and parcel of this globalization, or certainly internationalization of trade, and we were seeing really that shift back in 2011, 2012. So a much bigger kind of shift to that. Demographic changes, certainly in the UK, and again quite a large parts of Western Europe particularly, a bit of a drop in the birth rate. So we were seeing a slightly aging population, and a number of countries that were rather concerned about that kind of aging population and whether they would have enough younger people in the future working in order to be paying in and helping that elderly population survive. So those demographic changes have been of interest to employers and in society more generally. Changing employment relationship, this is really in relation to where people work, and again we think about this as focusing on at the start on big corporations, so we saw there was a slight decline. If we look back from 1990 to 2011, then we were seeing slight decline in the number of people who were working in large private sector organisations, so those with more than 250 employees. And we've actually seen a growth really in people moving into smaller companies, so perhaps setting up those small organisations, and that's something that we've certainly seen post the global financial crash. Increased participation of women, they were talking about then, so from the 70s to sort of the early 2010s, then we were seeing more women participating in the labour force, or feminisation of the workforce, as we might say. And that's continuing, and certainly a decline in collective institutions, by which we're really focusing on trade unions. So the number of employees who are members of trade unions, really the power of trade unions certainly in the UK has really been on the decline for a number of decades now. We know around Europe then we had the introduction of things like worker councils and other representative bodies, but there's been much more of an individualisation of the employment relationship, it's fair to say, where employees or workers need to negotiate more directly with the organisation. Now, if we look at current international trends and related some of those issues that I was just talking about, then one thing that we are seeing is where we've seen that shift of manufacturing from developed countries to more emerging countries, we're seeing that kind of shift in industrialization to deindustrialization, going through a more rapid cycle now in those countries. So we're seeing some of those other countries in the world that took on manufacturing for perhaps US, let's say, multinational corporations. They're now shifting to more of a service economy. So things are kind of rotating really around the globe more. Hopefully you looked at the introductory videos about Industry 4.0 and what we mean by that. And we're seeing now really a skills shortage in terms of those digital skills, and in areas like science, technology, engineering and mathematics, which are very reliant on all of that. There's a global shortage of enough skilled workers in those areas. So that's going to be a focus. It's certainly a focus now in the UK for the current government, putting pressure on higher education institutions to do more in that area, and really try and shift the balance of what students are studying, what skills and what subjects they're studying. High youth unemployment, and we've seen for the last decade or so, parts of Europe, for instance, have quite high youth unemployment, and it's those younger people that have been particularly affected by the recent COVID pandemic. They've often taken initial jobs in those kind of sectors such as hospitality, for instance, that have been really heavily affected by COVID. Women, and that kind of feminisation of the workforce. Women are making advances also into more senior roles within organisations. That tends to kind of wax and wane, and we need to look at kind of current figures and look at what's happening across different countries. And we're actually seeing some countries such as South America and parts of Eastern Europe that are making much quicker gains than many of the established economies. So reports by the ILO, the International Labour Organization, are quite useful to look at to see what's actually happening in relation to that picture on a more global basis. Some parts of the world are really focused on diversifying their economies. So, for instance, Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, really trying to decrease their reliance on oil and gas, and have a much more mixed economy. So that's a focus for a number of countries. Those kind of countries are quite often also trying to reduce their reliance on expatriate workers as they develop new areas of the economy. So we've got things like Saudiization, Vision 2030 and the Abu Dhabi 2030 plan. They're ongoing plans to try and develop local workforce. And in some parts that might be about sending certain workers away to be educated and to bring that knowledge back, and to kind of cascade it. We've certainly seen an increase in precarious employment, as academics call it, so what we might call the gig economy, where people are on 0 hours contracts, temporary work. Following the last global financial crash, we saw there was an increase in self-employment, so a growth in the number of small enterprises that were arising. That's what many people were doing. And their growth in what we call platform workers. So that's people who work for the likes of Uber, and some workers, for instance, Just Eat, those kind of platforms. There's a continued decline in trade union membership, although interestingly we are seeing some new unions arise as well, so kind of grassroots organisations. And I think it's going to be interesting post the COVID pandemic as to whether workers do start to organise a little bit more, and in order to try and kind of overcome some of the kind of challenging situations that they're facing. And that financial uncertainty really that will be there for a while as we emerge from COVID. So some of the big trends that we're seeing. Now, pre the global financial crash, I think it's fair to say that some people saw globalisation as an unstoppable force, that there would certainly be winners and losers, but those losers were going to have to adapt or suffer in terms of becoming obsolete. There was a view that national identities, distinct national identities and distinct industries would be history, and and that we talked earlier in the module about this kind of more standardization kind of approach, and perhaps there's a kind of shift to a kind of global approach by certainly big corporations, big multinationals. So those national identities and so on being seen as more obsolete. There was also concern that there was financialization, so access to money was in the hands of a particular group, what's been referred to as a technocratic elite. But it's fair to say, I think, that we're seeing in relation to that some really interesting startups and the use of technology to find means of giving people, say, in parts of Africa, access through use of mobile phones and very easy to use apps, access to finances, to credit, to be able to start perhaps very small kind of businesses and to get going, that never happened before. So we might say yes, an awful lot of money does sit in the hands of particular kind of groups, but I think we're also seeing some very interesting things in relation to financialisation and access to funding. Now, back in 2015, a report, The Future of Jobs, from the World Economic Forum, looked at future skills, and we're obviously now in the year 2021 as this has been recorded, but we can see a little bit of a change in terms of the skills that have been sought, or that were being predicted to be sought by employers over the last 5 or 6 years. And what we can see in the current kind of era is this demand for complex problem solving skills and critical thinking, which has been seen to move up the list. This is what the World Economic Forum was suggesting. Critical thinking was going to move up the list of skills sought by employers. And I put a note at the bottom. We talk a lot in academia about critical thinking and suggest that at master's level students are engaging in critical thinking and critical writing. And the definition here is about using logic and reasoning, using data that we get from knowledge, using evidence, academic evidence, to identify the strengths and weaknesses of different solutions, conclusions, or approaches to problems. So it's part and parcel of a complex problem solving. Creativity, we can see, has moved up the list from 10 in 2015, so seen to be more important, and that's creativity of thinking as well. With more complex problems, what are some alternative solutions where we don't have ready-made solutions, where we haven't solved problems in the past? What are our options? People management overall in a similar kind of place. Things around then coordinating with others. We can see that really, all this kind of collaboration is very important today, and being able to collaborate with others through skills such as emotional intelligence, using our judgment and decision making, and having a more service orientation. Negotiations drop down the list a little bit, and cognitive complexity. So again, really having the basis to get involved in all this more complex problem solving. Now, I mentioned on a previous slide when we were looking at international trends that there is this shift to what's been called the fourth industrial revolution, or Industry 4.0. I don't think we should get too caught up in terms. Some people will say this is more of a continuation of what was seen as the third industrial revolution, with the introduction of computers. And the term originated within the German manufacturing sector, and quite a large amount of this is very relevant to manufacturing. But we're seeing such things as robots, robots used in healthcare, in surgery. I was attending a webinar fairly recently, and a doctor was talking, suggesting that he thought that patients might be rather reticent about the introduction of robots, and he finds now when he's running outpatient clinics, seeing people pre-surgery, that they come and say, am I going to get the robot? And they really want the robot. So they've probably read that information about, robots are probably less, much less likely to make mistakes than humans who get tired are. So great patient acceptance, he was suggesting, of robots. Simulation, being able to simulate different kinds of processes, all sorts of different things, integration of different parts of manufacturing, for instance, the Internet of Things, so all the different devices that we might have both in factories and workplaces, in homes, so the way that our televisions, our fridges, our heating systems will all connect through the internet, all of these things producing data that we can analyse. So the era of big data and analytics that is associated with all of this. Additive manufacturing, where machines can be used to produce some very complex kind of component parts and hybrid types of systems and things. Augmenting reality in various different ways, and all of this is associated with issues around cyber security. So these terms you can read a little bit more about if you want to understand them in a bit more detail. And this is just related to the previous slide, really. We're in this era of mass connection and mass or big data. So all these different devices that we'll have on our person, such as Fitbits, or in our homes, in the workplace, which connect to the internet and which transmit data. And this has brought us to a place where in the workplace, many organisations, if not already, will be soon able to measure very much of employees' working day, what they're doing during the day. We've seen that through the COVID crisis, with more and more people working at home, and whereas perhaps in the past there's been an issue around control, and certainly some organisations are still very concerned about control of employees. They want their employees on site. A kind of a noted name might be Goldman Sachs, probably at the extreme end of things there, thinking that home working is an aberration. But many organisations have found that actually, people do work when they're at home, but also that they can monitor in different ways. And that then brings in into the discussion the kind of ethics of how we manage employees. We've probably seen, reports on the likes of Amazon, where, almost every minute of Amazon employees' day is kind of accounted for and can be measured, and people not being able to kind of go to the toilet freely when they want to. So there are those issues around kind of control and how we use technology in a more kind of monitoring, surveillance sense of employees. This is just giving you a quick overview of some of the terminology, and you might just want to pause here and just look at that for yourself for a moment. One of the concerns is in relation to machine learning and the application of AI when we're giving machines access to data, and about the fact that those machines may well learn from data that they're given to explore, as we might say, but actually they're not able to understand perhaps why that data comes to exist and how it comes to exist, and the fact that perhaps that data represents processes which may exclude certain groups, and this is the way then that machines might actually just simply be reproducing biases that already exist within more human processes, because they're learning from the data from those. Now, over the last kind of 10 or so years, there have been a number of debates within academia and more widely amongst kind of policymakers and professionals about the impact that all of this automation will have on jobs, on the future of work. And two Oxford academics, Frey and Osborne, back in 2013, predicted an almost what we might call an apocalyptic impact. They suggested that this digital revolution and automation would lead to just about 50% of jobs within the United States being automated. And that has really kicked off quite a debate. The OECD, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, are much more circumspect than that. They suggest far lower numbers of jobs, more like 14%, are highly automatable, but that would still lead to somewhere in the region of 66 million job losses worldwide. So it suggests there is going to be quite an impact for workers in the future. The question, of course, is how many of those jobs that are automated will then really be replaced by different jobs, jobs that we won't necessarily even know what they are at this stage in the process. Fleming, in a paper in the Journal of Management in 2018 about why robots might not want to steal your jobs, suggests that organisations have long moulded the application of technology in employment, and that's really where the debate very much is now. I attended an online workshop in March 2021 with Siemens. They have their kind of AI lab and very much involved in that kind of area of work, and very much where the discussion is at now, suggesting that really these are decisions about how far we let automation take place within our workplaces, what ways we use automation, artificial intelligence and robots, so on, is down to us really to decide. And very much debate now is about how we get this kind of cyber human interaction, so how we can get machines and people working together, predicting potentially teams in the future where we will have robots working alongside people, for instance, as part of mixed teams, hybrid teams. So Fleming suggested that this is something there's always been that kind of bounding or containment of automation ever since it's really arisen. Professor Mark Stewart at Leeds University in the UK is leading with other universities a Digital Futures at Work Research Centre. And January 2020, he was acknowledging the impact of new technologies on the future of work is one of the most pressing policy concerns of our time. And it's fair to say that this tag, the future of work, is being used by a number of different academic, practitioner-led research type centres. You can hear many different kind of Radio 4 in the UK has a number of different kind of discussion programmes about the future of work. So that kind of tag, future of work, really is everywhere now and being discussed by a very wide range of people. Now, there are a variety of implications for the increase in technology and increase in automation of processes. Some of them are listed here. So robots assisting production, automating parts of processes or specific tasks, machinery that's able to predict when it's going to run out of supplies or something's going wrong and actually notify somebody about that. Being able to actually manufacture multiple kind of components. Machines as a service is a specific business model where machines might actually be supplied, and then the company that does that is really making the money from the accompanying accessories that are needed to run those machines. Quality control via big data, allowing much clearer, more precise quality control processes, perhaps replacing people who would otherwise have been carrying out those processes, simulating actual production of products, the smart supply networks of things that are connected together in the same way that we have smart homes and smart cities, and this human machine integration. So as I talk about more hybrid teams, digital companions for people perhaps at home. There are instances where we can produce a twin, a digital twin of somebody, so that again, doctors can and see how they might operate on that person or how different things might work. So there are a whole range of ways that technology is going to impact. Now, we've talked about the implications of the advances in technology, and this led the UK government a few years ago to commission a report led by the Royal Society of Arts to explore possible scenarios for the UK labour market by 2035. And although this was focused on the UK labour market, I think we can see some application here in other countries. So this report by Delap Mason and Wallace Stevens identified 4 different scenarios or 4 types of economy that might come to the fore in future. The big tech economy, so we would see this rapid increase in the machine age, lowering production costs, this greater loss of jobs, and certain countries perhaps such as US and China gaining most from that. The precision economy, which was around this capturing all this data that machines are producing, greater surveillance of citizens, which is a concern, and also workers in the workplace. The Exodus economy was suggesting that actually we might see some challenge to the big corporations, the multinationals, and see a rise in different types of organisations, so worker cooperatives, much more employee-owned organisations. And I think we are seeing some of the younger generation perhaps, losing faith in some of those big brands type names. We're seeing the rise in maker type corporate, not companies, but organisations, things like the Fab Lab Foundation, a global digital kind of project which emerged from Massachusetts Institute of Technology and is a collaboration between universities, industry, local communities and so on. That's something that you can Google and have a look for if you're interested in that. And then finally, the empathy economy. The focus on advancing technology but hand in hand with people, making sure it develops in a way that is synergistic with the way people live their lives. And also this perhaps more focus in the economy on areas such as education, care work and entertainment, as people perhaps are working fewer hours in the future. Care work is really a growth area in a lot of European countries as their populations age. So there's a real need to try and encourage the workforce of the future to have an interest in moving into that type of work. And we know that care work is traditionally quite low paid work. So how can we make that a more attractive area of the economy for people to search for jobs in and train in? And this Future of Work report gave a summary really of different types of technology. So they talked about automation, who completes tasks. Automation changes who's responsible for doing things. That provokes questions in some instances about, if we think about self-driving cars and automation, that brings into account all sorts of ethical issues about who's responsible if that automated car has an accident and so on. And we can think about that in relation to perhaps other things that might be automated. Technology brokers, the relationship between buyers and sellers through platforms such as Uber, Just Eat, eBay and so on. It also aids that surveillance of the workforce. it to some extent. So it aids management in terms of monitoring workers, but also things like recruitment. So large organisations that receive high volumes of applications have been using technology for a long time to help sift through some of those applications. We've seen much more kind of video interviewing going on even for CEO roles in certain instances. And of course, there are then questions around whether some of the algorithms underpinning these kind of recruitment and selection processes are learning from what's happened in the past and thereby replicating biases against certain sections of the population. And then digitisation, where we're turning kind of physical goods or knowledge into some kind of data that we can capture it, we then can share it and replicate it at low cost. So things like Netflix do, Microsoft Office, those kind of things. With the COVID-19 global pandemic, then we've seen technology be highly useful, enabling people to adapt to the circumstances and to be able to work remotely and much more flexibly. And I think the debates about what the longer term impacts of people working at home, future choices, future design and structure of organisations is going to be. Those discussions are going to play out over the next 2 to 3 years as people start going back more fully to work, where they do so, and what types of options organisations are going to plump for in discussion with their workforces. We're certainly seeing rising unemployment, especially amongst younger people, so the kind of up to 24-year age group, and also amongst older workers. And this is because both of those groups have been disproportionately located in areas such as hospitality, retail and leisure that have been particularly impacted by the pandemic. Older workers, sometimes because they perhaps are working part-time in those sectors, they've had a career beforehand maybe, and are just working in for longer, but doing something rather different, or in some cases that might be their full-time job as well. We've seen Western economies particular have become much more dominated by service sector and by things such as hospitality and retail. So in terms of what all of this might mean for the HR profession, the couple of images here are just suggesting really that we've got people across all sorts of different occupational levels that are potentially going to need retraining. It might be retraining in a different occupation, or it might be just a reskilling after a period of time out of the workplace and out of doing the actual job that they're trained to do. We're going to have younger workers potentially with less workplace skills, so employers are now often looking for graduates who can fit well into the workplace quite quickly in terms of having good group social skills, team skills, being able to communicate well, quite effectively, things that universities and colleges are much more focused on than they once were. So those softer skills and attitudes. And a lot of those students gain those kind of skills through the part-time work that they do. And if that is in, bar work, for instance, or somewhere like that, and they've not been able to get those jobs for a year or two, then they're going to emerge perhaps from colleges and universities with less of those generic skills that employers are working for. Certainly, workplace design and organisation, which we've talked about in this module, is going to be something I think that people are going to be looking at in the next 2 or 3 years. You know, how do we structure? How do we enable collaboration, whilst also perhaps allowing people to work more flexibly from home? We might question, you know, are we going to continue to invest in innovation at the same pace that we have been doing? Will technological advances slow down if we're a less strong economy, or will they advance? I think given the reliance on technology that there's been, there's probably just going to be continued investment in that area. And there are also issues around the long-term gender impact on careers from women in particular taking a lot of the onus of home working and homeschooling over the course of the pandemic, and having to adapt in relation to that. So we're seeing you know, women be impacted already. If we look just in the area of academia, we're seeing a lot less submissions to journals from women academics than we were seeing immediately prior to the pandemic. That could, you know, pick up quite quickly afterwards, but that's likely to be the case in a range of occupations. So there are a number of different issues which are going to certainly have an impact for organisations and HR professionals, and I think we're going to see continually debated and worked on over the next 2 to 3 years. Thank you for listening.